Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Three Kingdoms upcoming DLC testing video. So, last time we did the Haeguang Cavalry, one of the two regional units for the Three Kingdom civs themselves, and this video, believe it or not, is going to be all about testing the other regional unit for the Three Kingdom civs, and that is going to be all about the Traction Trebuchet, which is your literal trebuchet replacement, because as many of you know, the Three Kingdom civs all get hero units instead of regular trebuchets, so this video is going to be all about, okay, what role does this Traction Trebuchet perform, how does it compare to its big brother counterpart, as well as Bombard Cannons, because it's something between the two units, as we will see. So definitely leave a like if you are interested in this unit, and if you have an opinion at all of the Three Kingdoms in rank. There we go, that's how you sell out, guys. Yeah, definitely stay tuned for plenty more content. The next three videos are going to be all about each of the individual Three Kingdom civs and going through all their testing and whatnot. And then we should be ready for the DLC, so hopefully that'll come out in time. Yeah, we can get them all out in time by May 6th. All right, so with that, let's jump right into it. Alrighty, so the Traction Trebuchet is, like I mentioned, the trebuchet replacement for the Three Kingdom civilizations. It is available at the Siege Workshop as soon as you hit Imperial Age, so not at the castle. And as you can see here, it costs 175 wood and 210 gold. This makes it 25 less wood than a trebuchet, which is 200 wood and gold. So a little bit more gold and a fair bit less wood. And here it says, powerful anti-building siege weapon with long range, but cannot attack enemies at close range. Strong versus buildings, can attack ground and destroy trees. So, like trebuchets, you have that anti-tree option. However, unlike trebuchets, we got those wheels, bro. They see me rolling. They hatin'. Okay, I'll stop. However, if you look at the stats, it really is kind of that hybrid between a trebuchet and a bombard cannon. So we have all three units right here, and let's just compare their stats. So starting with the HP, the Traction Trebuchet has 115, the Trebuchet has 150, and the Bombard Cannon has 80. So again, you sort of see the Traction Trebuchet splitting the difference between these two units. When it comes to attack though, Bombard Cannons have 40, Traction Trebuchets have 50, and Trebuchets have 200, so the Trebuchet going to be heavily outperforming in terms of raw damage. That said, Trebuchets deal pierce damage, as is shown by this little arrow right here, whereas the Traction Trebuchet does melee damage, as shown by this sword. So it's like the Bombard Cannon in that regard, dealing melee damage as opposed to pierce damage. This makes it a lot better against other siege weapons and things like rams. When it comes to armor, the Trebuchet, of course, has a ton. Well, it's 2 armor in Pact mode and 8 pierce armor, as is shown right here. And then there's, of course, at 1 melee armor and 150 pierce armor in unpacked mode, so of course taking very little damage from arrow fire. The Traction Trebuchet is much less by comparison. It only has the 1 mode, of course, but only 8 pierce armor. I mean, 8 pierce armor is good, right? That's a fully upgraded elite eagle warrior, but not indestructible. You can see the Bombard Cannon by comparison at 2 melee armor and 5 pierce armor. But with 115 HP, and then only 8 pierce armor, these guys can get taken down by strong ranged units relatively quickly. When it comes to range, the Traction Trebuchet, again splitting the difference between Bombard Cannons and Trebuchets, you have 14 range, which is improved by Siege Engineers, and then 4 minimum range. Trebuchets themselves, 16 range, and then 4 minimum range, so a little bit less range than a Trebuchet. Bombard Cannons, by comparison, have 12 range and 5 minimum range, so Bombard Cannons actually have a little bit more minimum range, but less overall range. Reload time is pretty interesting, though, because although a lot of these stats are more similar to the Bombard Cannon, you can see that the Traction Trebuchet has a reload time of 9 seconds in-game. Regular Trebuchets have 10, so it's, a little bit faster than a Trebuchet. However, Bombard Cannons have a reload time of 6.5, which is going to be a fair bit faster here than the Traction Trebuchet. Also, unlike Bombard Cannons, of course, Traction Trebuchets don't have any blast damage, it's all single target. So, the reload time for the Traction Trebs is still pretty slow. Also, movement speed is 0.6, which is slower than the Bombard Cannon's 0.7, and the Trebuchet's 0.8. So, packed Trebuchets move the fastest, then Bombard Cannons, then Traction Trebuchets, which move as fast as Mangonels. So right here you can see that, alright Ornlu, on paper it seems like the Traction Trebuchet is more or less somewhat similar to both the Bombard Cannon and the Trebuchet. Yes, kind of. Let's see how these guys are actually going to be performing. I guess before we do that, let's talk about civ bonuses. Of course, again, they are available to the Three Kingdom civs, Shu, Wu, and Wei. And each of these civilizations has some sort of bonus to the unit, so there is no real generic Traction Trebuchet. For the Wu here, they get the Sitting Tiger unique tech, so Traction Trebuchets, and then the Lo Chuans, as we showed earlier, fire additional projectiles. However, they do not get Siege Engineers to make up for that. Also, because the Wu don't even get capped rams, that Traction Trebuchet is going to be super important for destroying buildings with this civ. For the Wei, they get a civ bonus that their Traction Trebuchets cost minus 25%. So again, for a very expensive unit, that is a very nice bonus. But they also miss siege engineers. And lastly, the Shu get actually a civ bonus that is siege weapons and siege warships move plus 10 and for the purposes of the Traction Trebuchet plus 15% in the Imperial Age. So you get a movement speed of 0.69, which is pretty nice, and puts them at around the same speed as Bombard Cannons. So fairly minor bonuses for these units all around. Let's see how they perform. Alright, so here we have a fully upgraded Turkish castle, which is just a generic fully upgraded castle. And let's see just in the raw damage versus buildings how all of these units perform. So you can see the Traction Trebuchet rocks firing in much the same way that regular Trebuchets do. And let's see who is able to destroy buildings the fastest. Now, I don't have all the post-imp upgrades in yet, so all three of these Traction Trebuchets are going to be performing exactly the same. I mean, these are pretty chunky castles, but with all of the HP that these buildings have, it's going to be a nice difference showing which of these siege units performs the best. Now, you may know that Trebuchets outperform Bombard Cannons in a pure, anti-building role, which makes sense because Trebuchets are much more explicitly anti-building than the more generalist Bombard Cannons. But how do these Traction Trebs perform? Alrighty, guys, check this out. So the regular Trebuchet here is, in the next shot, going to be destroying the castle. The Bombard Cannon is still a little bit slower, but look at the Traction Trebuchets, guys. This already has me really concerned about the unit, because this test right here is just the most important test by far with this unit, because it is your Trebuchet replacement. This is all you get against buildings from long range. And it is just so freaking slow at destroying buildings without upgrades. See, the Bombard Cannon will destroy the castle in the next rock, Cannonball, and these castles still have a ways to go when being destroyed by the Traction Trebuchets. I mean, yes, it is easier to produce Traction Trebuchets than regular Trebuchets, as you can build them from siege workshops, but also keep in mind that Trebuchets will pop out of the castle right next to the castle, which is really invaluable in Treb Wars, so unless you have the siege workshops right on top of the castle, it'll take a hot second for the Traction Trebuchets to get there. So, I mean, yes, again, they're easier to mass than regular Trebuchets, but their ceiling is so much lower. And that is, of course, because of their attack. You can see 50 damage here and 175 versus buildings, so we'll call it 225 damage versus buildings, minus a little bit of armor. Whereas the Trebuchet has 450, so exactly half the damage of Trebuchets, while only attacking around 11% faster. That, guys, is not what I call especially impressive. Finally destroyed the castles a significant amount later than the Bombard Cannon and Trebuchet itself. Now, let's see how things are going to change with full upgrades. I realize now that the heroes do not affect siege weapons, so that's something to keep in mind. So no ships and siege weapons for the hero unit, so yeah, these Traction Trebuchets not going to be impacted by these heroes whatsoever. Now, other than that, this really just leaves chemistry giving you 1 extra damage, and of course siege engineers affecting all of these units, and Shu are the only of the 3 kingdoms to get siege engineers anyway. So let's see how things are going to be changing in Post-Imperial Age. So you get the extra projectiles here, of course, as the Wu. They're pretty clearly, it's pretty clear rather which ones are the secondary projectiles, as they're much dinkier. And of course, with the Wei here, you really need to rely on just massing these bad boys up with the cheaper discount, because the unit quality is pretty low. So I guess this is really just going to be a question of how do these Traction Trebs perform for the Wu with the extra projectiles versus siege engineers for the Shu. And of course, the Shu also move faster. And the Shu get 1 extra range, so 15 range. Yeah, this looks like one of those situations where the extra projectiles give you maybe 25% more damage versus buildings, versus the 20% more of siege engineers, so it looks like the Wu are probably the best. But how expensive is Sitting Tiger? Oh wow, well that's actually really cheap. So 400 food, 250 gold. So this is going to be even easier to pick up than siege engineers, which is 500 food, 600 wood. So yeah, it's kind of like what is it? The Chinese with their extra attack, but they don't get the extra range for their rocket carts. You have the Burgundians who get an extra attack for their Bombard Cannons, but they miss the range of siege engineers. Seems like it's going to be exactly the same here for the Traction Trebuchets. That said, in terms of, again, pure anti-building destructive power, it's not really a comparison. Regular Trebuchet already taking down this castle, and Bombard Cannon takes down the castle. But you can see that both Sitting Tiger and Siege Engineers do make a pretty notable improvement here for the Traction Trebuchets, as the Wei Traction Treb is falling pretty far behind. All right, so I think the next hit here for the Wu should seal the deal. Nope. The next one will, for sure. There we go. All right, so it's a few hits sooner here for the Wu relative to the Shu, and then you have the Wei, who are still going to be taking a fair bit longer. But even so, like I said, I'm still really concerned about a unit whose very basic role that you want out of a Trebuchet is to be able to destroy castles and, I suppose, towers. Like, above all else, that's what you need Trebs for. And there we go. That said, you still deal melee damage as opposed to the Trebuchet's pierce damage, so we still need to see how they perform against regular units. And by regular units, I basically just mean other siege weapons. Alrighty, so there aren't really that many matchups where you're actively using your traction trebuchets, as again, no blast damage means you're just going to be a lot worse than Bombard Cannons. But let's see at least how good you are at taking out Bombard Cannons. So this is, again, post-imp, and let's start here with the Wei. So this is still more or less a generic traction trebuchet, but you see how slowly they move. So I am going to be getting two-shot by a Bombard Cannon. And I two-shot the Bombard Cannons themselves. However, you move slower and fire slower, so the traction trebuchets are not really going to be all that impressive versus Bombard Cannons, but let's see if the other two civs can help make a difference. All right, now we're going to try the Shu here, who have the 1 extra range thanks to Siege Engineers, as well as, of course, that 15% faster movement speed, so at least we move at almost the exact same speed as a Bombard Cannon. And yeah, of course, we are going to be two-shotting it. Yeah, so it's at least going to be much easier to micro around here with the Shu. That 15% is pretty darn noticeable. But no blast damage does mean that you need to hit a direct shot, which means... Well, we can try with the Bombard Cannon perspective in a minute, but it should still be a lot easier to dodge the Traction Trebuchet shot than the Bombard Cannon. Now, let's see how much of a difference Sitting Tiger does. I mean, we still lumber around so much slower here as the not Shu. I mean, I guess you kind of get an area of effect attack. So I guess it's probably still a little bit easier to destroy there with the Wu just because it's going to be hard to dodge all of the projectiles because they don't all hit in the same exact area. So that's definitely going to be a bit helpful versus Bombard Cannons. Let's see how easy it is to dodge these projectiles as the BBC Civ. Alright, so let's see how we can do in microing against all of the Traction Trebuchets. I mean, obviously these Traction Trebuchets aren't microing around themselves. My point is that, because they're not perfectly accurate, and they deal no blast damage, it's not like it's completely inconceivable to destroy all of these Traction Trebuchets with just the Bombard Cannon. Yeah, I mean, I didn't even really try and micro there at the end. So, can we say that Traction Trebuchets counter Bombard Cannons? No. Can they have competitive fights against them? Yes. Would I still rather have Bombard Cannons? Also yes. But keep in mind that the Traction Trebuchets are cheaper than Bombard Cannons, although not by, like, an enormous amount. Especially as you're probably not making that many in a game. Alrighty, so the last test we really need to use is versus other regular Trebuchets. So let's see how impactful this is realistically. This is probably the best moment to shine for the Traction Trebuchet because it deals melee damage. Wait, do we get one-shot by enemy Trebs? Probably do. You just, like, not want to attack me, man? You actually will need chemistry to 3-shot Trebs because of that one melee armor that Trebs have. That's pretty funny. Chemistry's really important, guys, for your Traction Treb v regular Treb fights. No idea why this one isn't actually attacking me. Anyway, you do 3-shot it with chemistry, so I mean, like, I guess it can work. Let's see how this works. Yeah, you one-shot the Traction Trebs, as you do with Bombard Cannons. And you don't say Trebuchets hard counter Bombard Cannons, although they are still pretty usable. And they're not as easy to micro as Bombard Cannons. Alright, so here with the Wu, do we 2-shot the Trebs? Not really. Still 3-shot it. So in that regard, they are the same as Bombard Cannons, which also 3-shot Trebuchets. Alrighty guys, so closing thoughts here on the Traction Trebuchet. I mean, obviously you don't really use them in that many situations. It's really just versus buildings or other siege weapons. I mean, you'll make a lot of these with all 3 of these civs because that's all you have. That said, I really don't think the Traction Trebuchet is a very impressive unit. I mean, I guess maybe with the Wei it's like, okay, but It feels like in most situations, I would rather have Trebuchets or Bombard Cannons. They definitely feel worse than Bombard Cannons in, like, every single way. But again, you can get them as soon as you hit Imperial Age, and they're much cheaper than Bombard Cannons. So, like, I guess it makes sense that they are worse than Bombard Cannons. But, yeah, like I said, it is a unique unit. It's not like the Haegwang Cavalry, which just feels like a knight replacement. I mean, like, a good knight replacement, still a knight replacement. But yeah, these traction trebuchets don't excite me, but certainly let me know if you feel any different in the comments. And like I said, at the very least, you are going to be making a lot of them with all three of the civs, as that's what you have. Still, short little video, guys. Thank you all so much for watching. Next up, we will be covering the Shu in depth. So thank you guys, of course, for my Patreon supporters, with Dan and Jared in the Great Wolf tier, and Carolyn, Dieter, Liquid Egg Product, Shrairu, and Tanduri Knight in the Dire Wolf tier. Thank you guys all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.